I used to believe that silence meant peace. That if no one was yelling, no doors were slammed, no accusations thrown across the room, then everything must be fine. For years, that belief kept me steady while something underneath my life was quietly rotting. My marriage looked normal from the outside. We shared meals, paid bills, showed up to family gatherings together. But somewhere along the way, the warmth disappeared. Conversations became logistical. Touch became accidental. Eye contact felt optional. I noticed the changes long before I admitted them to myself. The phone that never left his hand. The way he'd step outside to take calls. How his laugh sounded lighter when it wasn't meant for me. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself every couple goes through phases. I even convinced myself that wanting more attention was selfish at my age. It was easier to doubt my instincts than to face what they were trying to protect me from. The truth didn't arrive in a dramatic explosion. Came quietly, almost politely. A message seen when it wasn't meant to be. A name I didn't recognize paired with a tone I hadn't heard in years. There was no denying it then. No room left for excuses. What hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal itself, but how easily my absence had been replaced. I felt interchangeable. Forgettable. Like my role had ended without anyone telling me. I didn't confront him right away. I needed time to breathe, to understand how my life could shift so suddenly without physically moving. When I finally did speak, there were apologies that sounded rehearsed and explanations that circled around accountability without ever landing on it. By the end of that conversation, I knew the marriage I had been trying to save no longer existed. Maybe it hadn't for a long time. The separation happened quietly. No dramatic goodbyes. Just boxes, paperwork, and a strange calm that followed me everywhere. I moved into a smaller place where the walls felt too close and the nights felt endless. Friends checked in at first, then less often. Everyone had their own lives, their own happiness to return to. I didn't blame them. I just felt left behind, and I spent most days replaying memories, wondering where I went wrong, what version of myself I should have been to keep him from looking elsewhere. Shame became my constant companion. I avoided mirrors. I avoided conversations that might lead to questions. I avoided hope altogether. It felt safer to assume that this was it for me. That my story had already peaked and everything left was just maintenance. At that point, I truly believed nothing unexpected could happen in my life again. I was wrong. I didn't tell many people what had happened. Not because I was protecting him, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The one person who noticed without being told was my nephew. He was always observant, the kind who listened more than he spoke. I hadn't seen him much during the separation, but one afternoon he showed up unannounced, holding a grocery bag like he wasn't sure if he should stay long. He didn't ask questions right away. He didn't give advice or say things would be okay. He just sat there, noticing the half-unpacked boxes, the quiet, the way I kept apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. Before leaving, he handed me the bag and said he'd stop by again soon. I didn't think much of it at the time. Kind gestures had started to feel temporary in my life. But he did come back. Not once, but regularly. Sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing at all. He fixed small things around the apartment without making a big deal out of it. A loose cabinet hinge. A light that flickered. Things my ex used to promise to handle and never did. What surprised me wasn't the help itself, but the consistency. He didn't disappear after the first visit. He didn't treat my pain like an awkward phase he needed to tiptoe around. One evening, while we were sitting in silence, he said something that shifted everything. He told me he'd noticed how much I'd changed over the past few years, how smaller I'd made myself to keep peace. He said he remembered a time when I laughed louder, spoke freely, and didn't apologize for existing. Hearing that from someone who had no reason to flatter me broke something open inside me. I hadn't realized how invisible I'd become. Even to myself, he never spoke badly about my ex. Instead, he spoke about choices and consequences, about how betrayal says more about the person who commits it than the one who endures it. He reminded me that loyalty isn't proven by staying silent through pain. It's proven by knowing when to walk away with dignity and tact. No one had framed it that way for me before. What took me by surprise wasn't just his emotional maturity but his patience. He didn't rush my healing or push me to move on. He showed up when I was low and respected my space when I needed quiet. He treated me like someone worth showing up for, not like a problem that needed fixing. That alone began to change how I saw myself. Slowly, the apartment started to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a place I belonged. I started sleeping through the night again. I caught myself humming while cooking. Small signs but meaningful ones. His kindness didn't erase the betrayal, but it softened its grip on me. It reminded me that not every relationship ends in abandonment, and not every bond is conditional. By the time I realized how much his presence had impacted my recovery, I also understood something else. The story I'd been telling myself about being disposable was wrong, and the most unexpected proof of that came from someone who owed me nothing, yet gave me consistency anyway. As weeks passed, the weight I'd been carrying didn't disappear, but it shifted. Instead of sitting heavy on my chest, it settled into something I could acknowledge without being crushed by it. I started noticing how my thoughts were changing. I wasn't replaying my marriage on a loop anymore. I wasn't dissecting every mistake, every compromise I'd made just to keep someone from leaving. The kindness I was receiving, steady and uncomplicated, forced me to confront a hard truth I'd been avoiding. I had accepted far less than I deserved for a very long time. There was a moment that clarified this more than anything else. I ran into my ex unexpectedly. It was brief and awkward. He looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to speak to me now that I wasn't playing my old role. He asked how I was, not really wanting an honest answer. I surprised both of us by giving him one. I told him I was doing better. And I meant it. Walking away from that interaction, I realized the power had shifted. I no longer needed validation from someone who had already shown me his limits. That night, I thought about how easily I'd blamed myself for his infidelity, how I'd internalized his choices as evidence of my failure. It was only after experiencing consistent respect again that I understood how distorted my thinking had become. Love shouldn't require shrinking. Commitment shouldn't feel like walking on glass. The betrayal hadn't started when he cheated. It started when I stopped being honest about how unhappy I was, and he chose escape over accountability. My nephew never framed himself as the reason for my growth, but he was the mirror I hadn't known I needed. Through him, I saw how normal it was to show up without expectations, how trust could exist without manipulation, how care didn't have to be earned through sacrifice. That realization was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it restored my faith in people. Painful because it highlighted everything I'd settled for before. I began making changes that had nothing to do with anyone else. I rearranged my space so it felt intentional, not temporary. I reconnected with interests I'd abandoned because they were inconvenient to someone else. I stopped explaining my past to people who hadn't earned the context. Slowly, my identity stopped revolving around what had been done to me and started forming around what I chose next. There was a quiet confidence that came with this shift. Not loud or performative, but steady. I noticed it in the way I spoke, in how I held eye contact, in how I stopped apologizing for having needs. The betrayal no longer defined me. It informed me. It sharpened my awareness and clarified my boundaries. I understood now that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about refusing to let it dictate my future. Looking back, the most shocking part of this chapter wasn't the infidelity itself. It was how close I came to letting it convince me that I was unworthy of consistency, honesty, and care. That belief almost became my permanent truth. Almost. What saved me wasn't romance or revenge, but something far less dramatic and far more powerful. Being reminded through simple, unwavering kindness that my value never disappeared just because someone failed to see it. By the time I reached the point where my days felt full again, I understood that healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, in moments you don't think to celebrate. Like realizing you no longer tense up when your phone lights up, or noticing that memories no longer control your mood. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly, over it. I simply woke up lighter. The final shift came when my ex reached out, months after our separation was finalized. He said he wanted to talk, said there were things he needed to explain. In the past, that message would have sent me spiraling. This time it didn't. I agreed to meet, not because I needed closure, but because I was curious to see how it would feel to face him without needing anything from him. He talked a lot about regret, about how things hadn't worked out the way he imagined, about how lonely he felt now. I listened calmly, noticing how familiar his patterns were. The deflection, the soft apologies that never quite turned into responsibility, When he finally asked if I thought we could ever fix what was broken, I answered honestly. I told him I had already rebuilt something better, and it didn't include going backward. The relief on my face surprised him. It surprised me too. Walking away from that conversation felt like closing a door I hadn't realized was still open. There was no anger left, no need to prove anything. Just clarity. The betrayal had lost its power over me because I no longer measured my worth by his choices. Later that evening, my nephew stopped by briefly, just to check in. I didn't tell him about the meeting right away. I simply thanked him. When he asked what for, I said for showing me what consistency looks like. He shrugged it off, uncomfortable with praise, but I meant every word. His kindness had never been about rescuing me. It was about reminding me who I was before I forgot. What happened next is what people find hardest to believe. Not that my ex faded into the background or that I learned to trust again, but that the most life-altering chapter of my story didn't end with bitterness or revenge. It ended with peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't depend on another person's presence or approval. I didn't rush into anything new. I didn't need to. I had reclaimed something far more important than a relationship. I had reclaimed my voice, my boundaries, my sense of self. I understood now that infidelity doesn't just break trust between two people. It exposes the cracks we ignore in ourselves. And if we're willing to face them, it can also become the moment everything finally changes for the better. Today, when I look back, I don't see a woman who was betrayed. I see a woman who survived being diminished and chose to grow instead. The unexpected kindness that found me didn't rewrite my past, but it reshaped my future. And that is the part no one ever expects. That sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the beginning of the most honest version of your life.